Hi, everyone. Welcome to episode 9 of the Foreign Policy Podcast Beyond Nation and State on Sunu India. I'm your host and independent journalist, Smita Sharma. You can listen in to all the audio episodes on the Sunu India app, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Our new episodes drop every Wednesday. Last year, in July of 2022, I was in Sri Lanka witnessing the Gota Go Gama chants by protesters. Now, the poetry and music of the Aragalaya movement resonated across the air as hundreds of thousands of anti-government protesters and activists remained camped since April in tents pitched across the Golf Face Greens, the coastal front in capital Colombo close to the presidential secretariat. Now, protesters wanted the resignation of President Gotabaya Rajapksa, the brother of Mahinda Rajapaksa, who was also forced to quit as Prime Minister. The island nation had been economically crippled last year, the worst financial crisis that it faced in its modern history, as there was a severe foreign currency crunch and citizens struggled for food and essential supplies. People had to wait in long serpentine queues outside fuel station for days of a single refill. Also, there were continued electricity shortages. By July, though, events unfolded fast with homes of lawmakers and politicians being torched, Gotabaya forced to flee Sri Lanka and resign, and six-time Prime Minister Ranil Wickremesinghe was elected the new president, despite the protesters demanding that the entire ruling elite should quit. Soon after, a brutal military crackdown followed on the protesters, and they were removed forcibly from the sites. In the last 1 year, Sri Lanka, assisted by India, Japan, the World Bank, has tried finding a way out of its huge international debts crisis and is seeking an international monetary fund bailout. President Wickramesinghe was in Delhi recently on his first bilateral visit since resuming office last year, and he held formal talks with Prime Minister Narendra Modi on 21st of July. But the big question is there faith in his leadership now in Sri Lanka? Does the country feel that it is headed on a positive trajectory? To understand what lies beneath the surface, I am joined today by Dilrukshi Handuniti. She is an award winning journalist and a lawyer. She is also the founder and director of the Colombo based Center for Investigating Reporting. On Twitter, you can engage with her as Dilrukshi H with a capital H. Dilrukshi, thank you so much for finding time to join me here on this podcast from Colombo.
Thank you, Smita, for having me. It's such a wonderful thing to be talking to you.
You know, I was mentioning about events last July, and I was there in Sri Lanka. Things were so chaotic, we couldn't even find time to meet in person given the fuel shortages, the electricity outages. How are you doing now? Is it business as usual? Can one say that on ground?
I think for any visitor, it would look like Sri Lanka has returned to normalcy, whatever you want to call seeming political stability. But if you really take a look at how people live, I think that's really where the story is, where the reality is. People actually generally lead a hand-to-mouth existence. A lot of people go without at least one meal a day, and jobs are becoming difficult to maintain. There are no salary increases for the middle class, and in any country, the middle class is the large majority of the people. If you think about farmers, farmers are so important because last year farmers were the ones who were in the forefront protesting, and this was linked to the fertilizer, the shift from chemical to organic fertilizer use. So that also had political repercussions, as we remember. So there is volatile currency, there is high inflation, and so there isn't the kind of normalcy you would expect. And it's also natural because it's only been a year since the political upheaval took place. So a lot of things appear to be normal. The queues have, of course, come to an end, but for how long? And what is the long-term strategy to return to the real normalcy that Sri Lankans are used to would be the real question.
But when you look at the government today, of course, it has increasingly, through its statements, been downplaying those protests by saying that they were really a response to the acute shortages of economic supplies, of whether it's electrical, the electric outages and all of that. Is that how do you think the protests should be defined? Was it really about just the hardships faced because of the financial crisis?
I think there are a lot of theories by now. A year after, we are able to analyze and see whether there were many reasons that drove the protests in Colombo. But I think the hardships were truly one serious reason for doing that. There would have been elements of politics and people who, I'm sure, Smita, you've heard about the theories of, interested groups investing in, supporting these protests. But overall, the hardships drove the average citizen to the street, and that cannot be negated. I mean, some of us may not have joined the protests, but then, there were a lot of well-wishers for this. And it's not only because of the hardships, and I think that would be a misnomer to say that it was simply because of the hardships. People connected the hardships to a governance crisis in Sri Lanka. And there is no way to get away from that responsibility. And the current dispensation is also responsible for offering answers as to why the protests happened. And if you just want to take away the queues and say your demands have been met, not so, then why are people demanding even now? Why are people still wanting to hit the streets now? There is a serious governance crisis, and that needs to be addressed. And the only way to dealing with it is not to crack down and take the protesters from last year, under, using various legal tools and, not so conventional ways of taking people into custody or, browbeating them into silence. So it's very clear that the government is very unhappy and very uncomfortable with the discourse here. And the people's protests have not been, they've been partially successful. I think it's a watershed moment in Sri Lankan political history that after 75 years of independence, people actually took to streets and drove an elected president out of office, and a man who was considered invincible at that point. But it's done. But you cannot be chasing presidents out of office all the time. So the next step would be to have a real discussion. And that discussion part is not happening. It is as if we've addressed the queues, and we all know these are temporary solutions, even addressing the queues. How much can you borrow from your neighborhood, from Asian leaders, from IMF? You really need some hardcore solutions to this question.
Okay, and before I come to that, Dilrukshi, because you just mentioned that citizens are being browbeaten or people have been thrown behind jails, unconventional methods that you referred to, because I do remember the protesters, and I was just speaking recently to one of them, Danes, who was also a leading face. He told me that how he had been in jail for 35 days, and now, of course, he's wanting to float his own political outfit. Is there any channel on for communication with ordinary people? So, are they being taken into confidence at all by the government of the day?
From what I know, it is not happening. And I think that's really important for two reasons. One is that young people who probably would not have hit the streets because they also don't subscribe to the old theories of, protesting and the political conversations people are used to having. So they felt that they had certain rights and they had to voice their protest against things that were happening in their own country, and that you had to determine your own future. So initially there was an invitation by the president to come and engage with him, but it didn't work at all. There was no real conversation. And then if you have a policy of saying no more protests in this country, because it's really not how I'm going to handle protesters and protests. But we are also going away from constitutional provisions, because we do recognize the right to protest. We understand that everybody cannot be protesting on a daily basis on any number of issues, but it is a citizen's right, because that is also one of those few citizens' rights that are available. If you don't know, if you don't like what's happening in your country, and if you think you have to hold the government accountable, sometimes it's way too late, perhaps, to wait for the next election. And looking at Sri Lanka, we don't even know when the elections are going to happen. So this channel of communication is not necessarily open, from what I know. And we do not engage young people. It's business as usual for those in power. They negotiate with countries. They negotiate with um, um, international lenders, but you're having that discourse. You're not really engaging and talking to your own people, and taking them into trust and saying, here is my plan for the next number of months, and this is why I'm talking to India or to China. These are the terms that we have agreed to. So it's very opaque.
Hmm. It's a very important point that you've raised, that it's business as usual for those in government, but clearly the hardships continue for the common people. What about the protesters, Dilrukshi? We saw the kind of brutal crackdown that had happened on them as soon as Ranil Wickremesinghe became president, following the events in July last year. How many of them still remain in jail? Are there numbers to suggest that there are still large number of people who are either facing the law, who are being harassed by legal agencies, or who are behind the bars?
I think majority of them are out now, but most of them are on bail. But the legal processes continue. So that's the other thing. When a legal process is continuing, this also means that the extra burden of having to go to court and to engage with that process. So that's one thing, and that is, at least we can count and say these are the number of cases. These are the people who have been, taken to task. But the regular protesters, they are being threatened. From what I know, they get messages saying don't hit the streets again. So whether it's government or other agencies, there could also be various other interest groups, other non-state actors. So when there is that sense of lawlessness, it's possible for all kinds of other groups to also be active and to be taking a course that is to their advantage. And a lot of parties are saying that it is happening. So there is general fear. If you notice that people do protest, but those protests are not the kind of protests you saw a year ago. So they're quite watered down. And even yesterday there was a crackdown. People were protesting, and this small protest. I really don't see why everything has to be cracked down. Every protest has to be disrupted. That the water cannons to be used. Let people protest and raise their issues as long as they are not breaking the law and harming public property or people.
Oh, just for the reference of those who are tuning in, we are recording this podcast on 24th of July. And when Dilrukshi talks about yesterday, she's referring to some protests that took place on
Okay.
Sunday. But Dilrukshi, have the other political parties, the ones who were in the opposition, who are still in the opposition, have they also signed on with this high-handed, iron-hand approach of Ranil Wickremesinghe? Are they backing him solidly at the moment when it comes to ensuring that there is no sort of chance of a protest being mobilized again?
That's an interesting question, Smita. I don't think Ranil Wickremesinghe enjoys that kind of support from within or outside, but he's still our president. And opposition parties have spoken against the kind of continued crackdowns, the lawlessness of it all, and the fact that we don't seem to be respecting basic human rights in Sri Lanka. It's actually a case study right now, because it's also very nuanced, very layered also. It's not just only what you get to see when a protest is attacked. There's a lot more that's happening. I don't think there is opposition support or even possibly there could be government support, and we know whose government he's heading, and this is the same government that the people wanted to get rid of, and the only thing is a cosmetic change of a president who probably has a plan of action which is different to that of the Rajapakshas, and possibly slightly impactful, at least is ended the queues. So beyond that is again another question. But I don't think he enjoys public support or political support, but whether he stops to wait to win that support is one thing. But I can also see that the protests from within the political parties, it's also lacking in vigor, lacking in power, and the fact that they seem to have also kind of accepted the status quo. These are whimpers of protests. It's not the kind of protest that we're used to seeing. It's like tokenistic protests, and I'm sure that people wouldn't like what I'm saying, but that's what we see as journalists and citizens. It's not good enough to just issue a statement or to make a speech and say what's happening is not acceptable. There isn't sufficient resistance.
So they're possibly just trying to check the boxes to show that, yes, we did raise our voice, even if it was just tokenism. What about their dealing with the media? Is the media narrative being controlled? Sri Lanka has also had a free press. There are independent voices. What are the challenges that you are facing today in your daily work?
Oh, there's a very recent challenge. For example, there was this issue about a few deaths because of supposedly a low quality vaccination that were used, and there was a lot of public discussion around that. And now the health ministry has issued a directive saying that without authorization you cannot speak to the media. So if every ministry starts issuing directives to that nature, who can a journalist reach out to? I mean, for voice cards, for information, journalists are eternally engaging with public departments and ministries and other institutions. So that's also a suppression of free expression, and beyond that, the right to information, because people have a right to know what we have purchased, why, when, how, and why it's going wrong. So this is a real overt move to control information about public health, and public health is absolutely important. And in a crisis, there could be many mini crises, and health is something so important. Health and education, two things that Sri Lanka was very well known for and recognized for. So if you have these issues in the health sector and public doesn't have access to information, who will mobilize that information for you? That would be the journalist. So to say that you are not allowed to speak to the journalist, that itself is a gag order, and that holds, that actually goes against every notion of democratic access to information, as well as people, every citizen's right to know what's going on, and whether we can actually access a public hospital without the fear of without having to worry about the kind of injection we might actually take, and what would happen if something goes wrong, and who's going to be responsible, who will offer the answers. So it's that's what I really don't like about what's happening. The fact that it's a system where you don't want to engage, you don't want to offer information, and I think information is key. Information is power.
And I think that is very unfortunate that South Asia as an identity today may not be something that has been weaved solidly together. But this definitely is a problem that is plaguing most countries, including India, where anybody who is critical of the government, who is vocal, a journalist who wants to exercise their right of being able to ask questions and get information and data, they face the biggest hurdles today. But Dilrukshi, you know, I am citing from your recent article where you wrote, as things stand, Sri Lanka's total public debt was a staggering $83.6 billion by the end of 2022, which is 28.3% of the country's GDP. And this comprises $41.5 billion in foreign debt and $42.1 billion in domestic debt. Huge debts that we are talking about. Now, you mentioned the queues have ended, but tell us a little bit more about what are the daily challenges for ordinary people. What about price rise? What about cost of commodities? What about electricity outages?
Well, the electricity outages have also come to an end. But what is unbearable is the price you have to pay for electricity. So we have seen a 50% increase of our, electricity tariffs. So it's
Wow.
insurmountable. I mean, I find it very difficult to pay that the bill that I
50%.
have.
When did they
Yes.
increase this?
This was early this year, and then there was a revision. So from 10,000 to 30,000, we have gone. It's more than. I mean, this is my bill. So it's for a person who's making 50,000, 70,000 rupees, it's going to be insurmountable, and it's going to be incredibly difficult to have regular electricity. I'm sure people are switching off their fans and you know. Lights whenever possible, because it's not possible to pay your electricity bills. And then also this volatile nature of our currency, the fact that it's eternally fluctuating, that also does not make anybody rest. And then let's also not forget the basic thing about food insecurity has increased, and it's of course not as bad as it was in 2022, but I do know, according to the estimates, that around 40 about 4 million people in this country, and we are just nearly 23 million people here, suffer from food insecurity. And in schools, I've gone to schools and seen children, being weighed for they're checking whether they're underweight, whether they're bringing food, and there is a free school meal in public schools, and then probably that's the only meal that some children have. So those hardships remain, and it's not what you get to see when you walk on the streets of Colombo. And not to mention the brain drain. We have lost a lot of people, skilled people, and the estimate also shows from January to May, over 433,000 people have traveled overseas, and 15,000 doctors have already left in the first 5 months of this year. So these are authentic estimates. So if that's the problem we have, obviously we are not creating more jobs, we are not retaining the people we have invested in. And even if you have new programs, and I know Sri Lanka is talking to India about a lot of bilateral initiatives. So where would you find the human resource to make these programs work? That's also important. You can't be hiring people from overseas to work on these projects if you get them, underway. So we are losing the skilled people. We are also losing the low skilled people. There's this surge of people moving to the Middle East, and we are a labor exporting country, and the numbers are increasing. I think we are going to also have an issue of, critical labor not being available in the country. And that's going to be very important when you want to repay your debt, because you need to have revenue generation through enterprises.
So, there are these humongous hurdles in a country of 22 million people. But one of Sri Lanka's curse has also been that it has just been so dependent on tourism essentially for all kinds of revenue generation. Are economists suggesting a way out of how do you diversify on the ways of generating revenue for the country so that you don't keep repeating these cycles time and again?
That's an excellent question, Smita, because this is something that the leaders for the past 75 years have not necessarily provided an answer to the people uh, for, right? And being so dependent on imports in a country that has a lot of resources, and the fact that we have not been so interested in developing our own industries. And if you look around the rest of Asia, India and China included, there is an obvious investment in generating your own income, and developing your own industries. Sri Lanka has never really looked at it. We have always been thinking about a service economy, but we are not really good at that either. So if you really want solutions, and the economists are saying that we need to look at new models, more cycles of borrowing is not going to solve our problem. And again, when you think about the areas of silence or lack of sharing of information, would also be this would be one such, where we would also want to know what is your blueprint for the next 2 years and 3 years, because when you have to go into debt servicing, how will we repay beyond taxing people who are already dying under the tax burden, who cannot actually fend for themselves and who are leaving the country because in desperation? You also have to reach a point of servicing these debts, and then you have to have industries, really functional industries. And you're not going to start new initiatives and see the fruits in the next 2 years, obviously not. So this also drives a lot of suspicion among people. And that is something to be factored in. When people show animosity, distrust towards China or India, it comes from the fact that people don't know what deals are being struck on their behalf by the government.
So, which would also mean that people are not buying the assurances that keep coming in from Ranil Wickremesinghe in front of institutional lenders, other countries, when he says that the country will be able to overcome bankruptcy by September. So, are people doubtful? Are people still resentful? Are they just frustrated? Have they just given up? What is it?
Doubtful and resentful, yes. Doubtful because you have to take people into your confidence. People did not drive this country to bankruptcy, but its leaders did. So you actually owe answers to the people. And I think this disengagement and disrespect for the populace is something that continues. And this was so with the previous regime, and it is so with the current regime. These tokenistic discussions and tokenistic statements are not good enough for a country that is going through this kind of hardships. So that is one, the lack of communication from the political leaders in this country. And the second thing is that you really have to have economic plans, and you really have to use the brains that are available in the country to its benefit and come up with a new agenda. So people do not trust. People actually fear. People fear when the Sri Lankan government says we are negotiating for a bailout. The bailout, I think, at that given moment was critical because we needed to win the trust of other bilateral or multilateral lenders, that we still can, raise our head. Raising our head doesn't mean that we actually have a solution. And also people expected, this is unfortunate, the desperation was such that people expected things to suddenly improve after the bailout. The bailout was not meant to be that. Bailout was meant to be something else. So it's just to get your head up a little bit out of these deep waters. And then you need the next set of plans. So people fear when the government says that we are engaging with multilateral donors or bilateral donors, and when there are discussions about initiatives, all kinds of developmental plans that are going to commence, people fear. And I think at the core of that fear is also the lack of information, and also lack of political and economic knowledge. That economies are very unique things, right? What a country like China could do is not something that Pakistan or Sri Lanka could be doing, for example. So there is something about a size, the economic model, and what works for each nation. But you have to also understand what can work for Sri Lanka, what models can work for Sri Lanka, but understood that the old model doesn't work for us.
So, just coming to the last part of this conversation, I mean, when it comes to India's role, and just to let some of our unversed listeners and viewers of this video know that India so far actually has provided around $4 billion of financial and humanitarian assistance. This has included fuel, medicine supplies, food supplies during the peak critical hours. It was also the first creditor which actually extended a letter of support towards Sri Lanka's debt restructuring efforts that was crucial to kick off that process of a bailout from the International Monetary Fund. And Ranil Wickremesinghe, when he was in New Delhi, we saw a lot of focus being on technology, on renewable energy, on greater connectivity, including some projects in Trincomalee in the east. For the ordinary Sri Lankans after this crisis, Dilrukshi, has the view towards India, the approach towards India, do you sense that there has been any change?
Unfortunately, Smith, I think India would always be treated as suspect. And this is general, it's a very broad general statement. But having said that, there are, people with more nuanced understanding, and people who do understand that the neighborhood first policy would also extend to supporting Sri Lanka in its deepest, darkest hour. So that's what you see at ground. But the strategic cooperation components of what was discussed and the kind of humanitarian assistance that was given, it was critical. I think there was a surge of failing, some kind of shift last year when we spoke to people. Of course, there was always that doubt as to why they would want to do that. And this is a very historical thing. And that's entirely another discussion, why generally Sri Lankans would look at India that way. But besides that, but I saw people responding positively to that whenever we spoke to them. They felt that India came to assist Sri Lanka when Sri Lanka had no friends, technically. And two types of funding, and also the fact that India stood by Sri Lanka when we needed that bailout package, and to lock the other creditors into a discussion that India backed Sri Lanka. But these are not things that the average citizen would necessarily understand how it works and why it works.
But then, does the average citizen actually get into a comparison of what China is doing, what its debt trap is doing, vis-a-vis what India's role has been in Sri Lanka? Is that a common discourse on the streets?
I think the past 1 year has been enlightening to most Sri Lankans. And if you never understood Indo-Sri Lanka relations or China-Sri Lanka relations, I think there is at least slightly better understanding because of the crisis we got into and what debt can do and what it can do. It can actually break a fairly decent country and make you go through all these hardships. So that, I think, that much is understood. But what is also not understood is in terms of repayment, in terms of renegotiating your loans, what it would mean technically for you to the sign-ups, what do you sign up for. The people understand that still China is pretty elusive, and in having this conversation about settling debt and getting into a repayment scheme, that China is still not forthcoming, and whereas India has played a very different role. I think generally some people, those who at least have some fair of understanding of foreign policy, would know and accept that India's role has been very different to that of China. But they would also unpack that Indian approach as in terms of a foreign policy discussion, it would be seen in a different light. To the common citizen, I think it's more about what would happen in Trincomalee. Do you want a base there? Is it a military base? Are you going to pump out our oil? And there were discussions about this land connectivity with the northern part of Sri Lanka, and the Nagapattinam ferry service. So these are things that we have been talking from day dot. But now people see the possibility of these things becoming reality, and this reality is linked to debt servicing. And this really drives. There is no way to work around it, and this is fact. So people fear that, and probably people feel comfortable with the tourism promotion that's happening between India and Sri Lanka, because Indians are seen as they're very similar to us and culturally very connected. But the introduction of Indian currency and the kind of developments that are taking place in the eastern parts of Sri Lanka, in Trincomalee, the strategic connectivity, the ferry service, all of these could actually drive fear among some people. And of course, when you talk about energy, there would be also some issues about maritime security. People would also worry about maritime security of the Sri Lankan state. There would be all kinds of concerns. So again, we go back to that initial point, Smita, of sharing information, how countries and regions groupings. For example, how ASEAN would work as a region and move forward. So whether South Asia has the capacity beyond SAARC to do that, and whether we have the will and the ability whatever name we want to use it, and whether we're going to do that, and whether it is of benefit to the Sri Lankans to work closely with India or with China on certain issues. As you said, China cannot be discounted. China will be there knocking on our doors, asking us to, service the debts. So to do that, the Sri Lanka will have to work with those who are willing to work with Sri Lanka. And this would mean some initiatives that may be palatable or even unpalatable to the public. And some of these could be very hard decisions that the political leaders of this country got to make. And we have seen historically sometimes that such decisions having been made. But I think critical that we talk to people, that this kind of general understanding becomes something, citizens get to have that information. Without
Right.
that, you cannot say that people will not revolt, people will not act again.
Absolutely. An information black hole doesn't work well, neither for the ruler nor for the ruled. Dilrukshi, during the last year's the Aragalaya movement for over 100 days, and so one of the points that was being talked about was that how this has also united the country in many ways, bringing together the ethnic divisions, the religious divisions. Is that something that continues when it comes to the issue of the Tamil minorities, for instance? Is there a societal approach which is different today that you feel?
I think desperation, the kind of strife, the kind of difficulties we experienced last year showed every citizen in this country that only united we stand. If you're divided, you definitely fall. So I think also the young generation, people understand. They do not even have memories of the war. They did not live through those years. So it's a new generation of people and protesters. Their ideas would be different, and the political leaders must factor in that they don't carry the baggage that previous generation carries, and they deserve a different future, and they should be allowed to define a future in which we do not stand polarized along ethnic religious lines. It was quite heartening for people to come together, and I also think there is greater understanding and some kind of emotional connectivity, if I may say so. For the first time, from in the southern parts of Sri Lanka, people actually understood what kind of strife was there in previous years, in the northern part of Sri Lanka, and what drove the conflict, what was what was creating that dissent and dislike, or lack of acceptance of the political leadership in the south. So I think that understanding exists, but when you're polarized, and we've been polarized for decades, 1 year of connectivity is not going to be get cemented so quickly. And it's also very easy for politicians to come and play that same old game of divide and rule. So we're back to, in some ways, to being the Sinhalese Buddhist nation that we wanted to be. You still have that discourse, but at the same time, there is some kind of pushback, and that's a good thing. And I think Aragalaya has changed the way we approach things, the way we look at the political power play, and what you can do as a citizen. So even if it did not bring the everlasting, changes that it may probably wanted to see, some changes have taken place in the people's psyche, and I think those are beneficial, that we would look at things differently. We will have a youth-led approach, and the fact that we do not recognize those old historical grudges against each other.
That's good to hear, Dilrukshi. Just a final question. The elections, of course, have been stalled by the government indefinitely, citing that there is no funds really. The country is still in that desperate financial situation to be able to afford holding of the elections. How you think people will continue being patient with this for some time to come? Is there a restlessness that is growing maybe within the youth sections who were part of the Araglai movement?
There is a lot of restlessness, and young people, particularly those who are associated with the Aragalaya movement, are really feeling it. And they're the ones who are being hounded by the state as well. So they are being hounded, and they are also the vocal people in this country. They're the ones who are bringing up issues. And of course, there are elements of politics, and there are political parties also taking part in protests and having their own protests. How far, I think it would be very important for the political leaders of this country to really understand that you cannot continue this way without elections, without engaging the public, without seeking a public mandate for very critical decisions. That you just cannot say that we are in office and we are going to serve this period as we deem it fit. We are a democracy. We are not any. I mean, that's the style of governance we have chosen. So you do have to go by that. I think the dissent will brew and it will continue to simmer. But there could be, at a time when some very critical, decisive things are being decided upon by the state, there could be people protesting all over again. And this time it would not be about the queues. This time it would be about people not being heard and people not being allowed to make those political choices.
Thank you so much, Dilrukshi. Enlightening as always, for putting things into context, for explaining what is really happening inside Sri Lanka today beyond some of the headlines that we get to read in international press, including in India. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Meta. Wonderful speaking to you as well.
That's all that we have time for in this edition of Beyond Nation and State. You can engage with me on Twitter at Smita_Sharma. I'm on Insta and Facebook as Smita Sharma Journalist, and that's also the handle for my YouTube station where the video segment of this podcast drops later. So thanks for tuning in. Do not forget to download the Suno India app, and you can also listen into all the past episodes on Suno India app as well as the Spotify podcasts. If you do tune in, please do share your feedback as well as leave your ratings on the app. Thanks again and take care.